The metal cuffs bit into my wrists as Sheriff Sheila tightened them with unnecessary force. My son's soccer cleats skidded to a halt on the field as his eyes found mine across the distance. Confusion, fear, humiliation, all reflected in his 10-year-old face. "Dad, what's happening?" His voice cracked as the other children stopped playing. Sheriff Sheila leaned closer, her badge catching the Saturday morning sunlight. "You were warned about disrupting community events, Mr. Wilson. Now you're trespassing on county property." "This is a public field," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the cold metal digging into my skin. "You can't ban a parent from watching their own child play." She adjusted her mirrored sunglasses, a practiced smirk settling on her face. "I make the rules in Oak Ridge County. You should have thought about that before challenging my authority." As she guided me toward her cruiser, I caught a final glimpse of my son standing alone, abandoned on the field. That was the moment I realized I would not just fight back against Sheriff Sheila. I would take everything she thought she controlled. There is something sacred about Saturdays in Oak Ridge County. For most folks, it means sleeping in, yard work, or running errands. But for my son, Jackson, it means one thing only: game day. And for me, as a single father working 60-hour weeks at the lumber mill, Saturdays are the rare moments when I can forget the world and simply be a dad on the sidelines. The community soccer field sits at the center of our small town, nestled between pine trees that have witnessed generations of children growing up beneath their branches. The field itself is nothing extraordinary: patchy grass, weathered goalposts, and bleachers that creak under the weight of enthusiastic parents. But to Jackson, this place is hallowed ground. To him, it is where friendships form, where lessons about teamwork and perseverance take root, and where, for 90 minutes each week, he feels truly free. I remember the first time he scored a goal. He was 7, all knobby knees and determination. The ball barely crossed the line before he turned, not to his teammates but to me. His eyes searched the crowd until they found mine. That smile, pure joy radiating across the field, is etched into my memory. Being there for those moments is not optional. It is everything. Our town is small enough that everyone knows everyone. Sarah Miller sells homemade cookies at the concession stand. Coach Bentley has been volunteering for 15 years despite having no children of his own. Old Mr. Peterson never misses a game, cheering for every child regardless of which team they play for. We are a community bound together by these simple rituals. Sheriff Sheila Donovan arrived in Oak Ridge 3 years ago from some big city department. No one asked for her, but the county officials were impressed by her credentials. She began overseeing park security, a job that had never required much attention before. Initially, she stayed in the background, occasionally driving by in her cruiser or standing at the edge of events with arms folded across her chest. The changes came gradually. First, it was designated parking areas marked with threatening tow signs. Then came noise ordinances enforced during games. Parents received citations for setting up chairs too close to the field boundary. The warmth of our Saturday gatherings began to cool under her surveillance. I noticed Jackson becoming tense on game days. His eyes would dart to the parking lot, checking if her cruiser was there. The carefree joy of soccer was being eroded, weekend by weekend. "Dad, why does Sheriff Sheila always look so angry?" Jackson asked one evening as we drove home from practice. "Some people forget what it is like to be a child," I answered carefully. "Or maybe they never knew in the first place." The breaking point came on an unusually warm Saturday in April. I had parked where I always parked, at the edge of the gravel lot under the big oak tree. When we returned after the game, there was a citation on my windshield: "Unauthorized parking, $75 fine. I looked around in disbelief. There were no signs, no painted lines, nothing indicating this spot was suddenly forbidden. Through the window of her cruiser, I could see Sheriff Sheila writing more tickets. Her face showed no emotion, just mechanical enforcement. Jackson clutched his participation medal, his eyes wide. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" "No, buddy," I said, pocketing the ticket. "Just a misunderstanding." But it was not a misunderstanding. As other parents discovered the bright orange papers tucked under their wipers, frustration rippled through the crowd. This was the third weekend in a row she had found some new rule to enforce. I walked over to her cruiser and waited until she rolled down her window. "Sheriff Donovan," I began, keeping my voice level and respectful. "There are no signs indicating these spots are restricted. Most of us have parked here for years." She removed her sunglasses slowly. "The county ordinance clearly states that parking is restricted to designated areas only. These are not designated areas." "But there are no designations marked anywhere," I pointed out. "How are families supposed to know where they can park?" "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, Mr. Wilson." She knew my name without asking. "Perhaps you should attend town council meetings if you want input on local regulations." "Perhaps proper signage would be more effective than ambush ticketing," I replied. "These are parents supporting their children, not criminals." Something flickered across her face, a tightening around the eyes, a slight clench of her jaw. "Your concern has been noted," she said with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Have a nice day." I walked back to my car, unaware that I had just painted a target on my back, unaware that Sheriff Sheila was not someone who forgot perceived insults, unaware that next Saturday would change everything. The following Saturday dawned clear and beautiful. Jackson was up before the alarm, pulling on his blue and white uniform, checking that his cleats were clean, repacking his bag 3 times to make sure nothing was forgotten. His energy was infectious, and I found myself humming as I prepared orange slices and filled water bottles. "We are playing the Westfield Rangers today," Jackson announced, shoveling cereal into his mouth. "Coach says if we win, we might make the regional tournament." "Then we better get there early for extra warm-up," I said, ruffling his hair. We arrived at the field 45 minutes before kickoff. The morning dew still clung to the grass, catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. Other families were setting up chairs along the sidelines, thermos bottles steaming in the cool morning air. Jackson jogged onto the field to join his teammates while I unfolded our chairs in my usual spot. I had just set down the cooler when a shadow fell across me. Looking up, I found Sheriff Sheila standing there, her stance wide and authoritative. 2 deputies flanked her, hands resting on their belts. Something cold settled in my stomach. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby parents to hear, "I need you to pack up and leave the premises immediately." I stood slowly, confused. "Excuse me." She held out an official-looking paper. "This is a notice informing you that you have been banned from all county recreational properties due to disruptive conduct. You are not permitted to attend any events here for the remainder of the season." My hands trembled slightly as I took the paper. The words blurred before my eyes: repeated disruptions, aggressive behavior toward officials, intimidation tactics. None of it was true. None of it had happened. "This is absurd," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I have never disrupted anything. My only interaction with you was a civil conversation about parking tickets." Sheriff Sheila's expression remained impassive. "Multiple witnesses have attested to your disruptive behavior. The decision has been made by the Park Safety Committee. What committee? Who are these witnesses? I looked around at the other parents who were now watching with uncomfortable expressions. This is about me questioning you last weekend, is not it? She ignored my question. You have two options, Mr. Wilson. Leave quietly, or I will have you escorted off the property and charged with criminal trespass. On the field, Jackson had noticed the commotion. He stopped mid-drill, the ball rolling away from his feet as he watched the scene unfolding. His coach called to him, but he remained frozen, eyes locked on the deputies standing beside me. My son is about to play, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. I have never missed a game. There has to be some mistake. No mistake, she replied. Deputies, please escort Mr. Wilson to the parking lot. The deputies stepped forward, not roughly but with clear intent. One of them, a younger officer named Ramirez who had coached Jackson's team 2 seasons ago, would not meet my eyes. Please, Scott, I said quietly to him. You know me, you know this is wrong. Deputy Ramirez glanced up briefly, something like shame crossing his face. Just following orders, James. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. By now, every parent was watching. The children on the field had stopped practicing, all eyes on the man being escorted away by police. My humiliation was complete and public, exactly as Sheriff Sheila had intended. Dad, Jackson's voice cut through the silence as he ran toward us, panic in his eyes. It is okay, buddy, I called, trying to sound calm. There is just a misunderstanding. Go back to your team. Sheriff Sheila stepped between us. Return to the field, young man. Your father needs to leave. Jackson looked from her to me, confusion and fear evident on his face. But the game. I will fix this, Jackson, I promised. Play your best. I will be waiting after the game. The deputies guided me firmly toward the parking lot. Parents parted to let us pass, some looking away in embarrassment, others watching with morbid curiosity. No one spoke up. No one intervened. Fear is a powerful silencer. As we reached my car, Deputy Ramirez murmured, I am sorry, James, just do not fight this right now. I nodded numbly, getting into my vehicle. Through the windshield, I could see Jackson standing alone at the edge of the field, watching as I drove away. His small figure grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and something broke inside me. The hurt in his eyes would haunt me for days to come. But in that moment of deepest humiliation, something else was born. Something Sheriff Sheila Donovan had not counted on. Rage can burn quickly and fade to ash. But determination, cold, calculating determination, can reshape worlds. Humiliation quickly hardened into resolve. That evening, after tucking Jackson into bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and my laptop. The house was quiet except for the occasional ping of the old radiator. Outside, rain had begun to fall, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Jackson had barely spoken during dinner. When I asked about the game, they had lost 2-1. He just shrugged and pushed food around his plate. Why does Sheriff Sheila hate you, Dad? He finally asked as I was saying good night. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications a 10-year-old should never have to consider. She does not hate me, buddy, I lied. Sometimes adults disagree about rules, that is all. But as I typed Municipal Code Oak Ridge County into my search bar, I knew this was far more than a disagreement. This was an abuse of power, pure and simple, and I would not let it stand. I dove into research, printing county ordinances, park regulations, and public property statutes. The dining table slowly disappeared under spreading papers. Yellow highlighter marked contradictions and loopholes. By 3 in the morning, my eyes burned, but my heart raced with newfound knowledge. Sheriff Donovan had overreached. The Park Safety Committee she had cited did not exist in any county documentation. The witnesses to my supposed misconduct were never named. Most importantly, no single county official had unilateral authority to ban citizens from public recreational facilities without due process. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. I drove to the county clerk's office as soon as it opened, requesting public access to field use permits and property records. The clerk, Mrs. Hannigan, raised an eyebrow but asked no questions as she led me to the records room. "Take your time, James," she said, her voice lowered. "My grandson plays on Jackson's team. What happened Saturday was not right." It was the first sign that I was not alone in my concerns. Throughout the week, I made careful inquiries. I spoke with other parents after school pickup, at the grocery store, outside the barber shop. Their stories emerged hesitantly at first, then with increasing urgency once they realized they were not alone. Sarah Miller had received a citation for unauthorized food distribution. At the concession stand she had run for 8 years. Coach Bentley had been threatened with a noise complaint for using his whistle excessively during practice. The Johnsons had been warned about inappropriate cheering when they celebrated their daughter's goal. "We just stopped arguing with her," Sarah admitted, looking around nervously as if Sheriff Sheila might appear. "It is easier that way." Fear had silenced an entire community, but fear can work only when people feel isolated. Connected, we might find courage. I began documenting everything, photographing the field, recording conversations with affected families, keeping meticulous notes. I set up a private online group where parents could share their experiences anonymously. The stories poured in. Sheriff Sheila's reign of petty tyranny was more extensive than I had imagined. Meanwhile, Jackson grew increasingly withdrawn. He began forgetting his soccer gear on practice days. His coach called to tell me he had skipped a session, something he had never done before. "He feels caught in the middle," Coach Bentley said. "Kids should not have to navigate adult power struggles." He was right, and the realization cut deep. This was affecting my son in ways I had not anticipated. I needed to resolve this quickly, not just for myself, but for Jackson. On Wednesday afternoon, I made an appointment with the town clerk under the pretense of discussing property tax assessments. Mr. Pullman was a frail man who had served the town for over 30 years. If anyone knew the truth about the soccer field, it would be him. "What exactly are you looking for, Mr. Wilson?" he asked, adjusting his thick glasses. "I am trying to understand the jurisdiction over the community sports field," I explained. "Specifically, who owns the land and who has authority to regulate access." He shuffled through several folders before pulling out a thick file. "That property has an interesting history," he said, spreading out a survey map. "Most folks assume it is county land because it is adjacent to the municipal park." My heart quickened, but it is not. Mr. Pullman shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. The field itself was originally part of the old Millbrook estate. When the family fortune dried up in the 60s, most of the land was sold to the county, but that parcel," he pointed to the soccer field outlined in faded blue ink, "that was placed in a private trust for community recreational use." "A private trust," I leaned forward. "Who manages it now?" "That is the thing," Mr. Pullman said, lowering his voice. "The trustees died years ago. The county has been maintaining it by default, but legally," he tapped the paper meaningfully, "legally, it is still private property under trust provisions." As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. What Mr. Pullman had shown me next changed everything. The Millbrook Trust had fallen into tax delinquency 3 months ago. With no living trustees to manage it, the property had been quietly placed in a queue for public auction to recover the owed taxes. Sheriff Sheila did not own the field she was so eagerly policing, and soon someone else might. The revelation about the field's ownership status consumed my thoughts. That night, after Jackson was asleep, I contacted a lawyer friend from college who specialized in property law. Mark listened patiently as I explained the situation, asking pointed questions about the trust documentation and tax records. "This is fascinating, James," he said when I finished. "If what you found is accurate, then Sheriff Donovan has been enforcing county regulations on private property without proper jurisdiction. More importantly, if the trust is indeed failing, there could be an opportunity here." "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, though I already had an inkling of where this might lead. "The property will go to silent auction rather than public auction," Mark explained. "It is a procedure designed for tax-delinquent properties with complicated ownership. Fewer bidders, less publicity." My pulse quickened. How does one participate in such an auction? "Very carefully," Mark replied. "And with the right paperwork, I can help with that." The next morning, I withdrew a substantial portion of my savings, money I had been setting aside for Jackson's college fund, and met with Mark to prepare a bid. It was a risk, perhaps the biggest financial risk I had ever taken. But when I thought of Jackson's face as I was escorted from the field, no amount seemed too great. While these plans progressed in secret, Sheriff Sheila continued her campaign unchecked. The Saturday after my expulsion, I parked across the street from the field, watching from a distance as Jackson played. He scored the winning goal but did not search the crowd afterward. He simply walked back to position, head down. The joy had been stripped from his game. I learned from other parents that Sheriff Sheila had stationed a deputy at the entrance specifically to watch for me. She had made examples of 2 other fathers who had questioned her methods, issuing them warnings about creating a hostile environment. The message was clear: challenge her authority and you would be next. 3 agonizing weeks passed as I worked the legal channels with Mark's guidance. I attended the silent auction with sweaty palms and a racing heart, submitting a bid that represented years of careful saving. Then came the long wait, checking my phone constantly, jumping at every email notification. Mark called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work. "James," he said, his voice vibrating with excitement. "Congratulations. You are now the proud owner of approximately 5.2 acres of prime community real estate." I stepped outside the lumber mill, the spring air suddenly sweeter than I remembered. "It is done, legally binding." 100%, Mark confirmed. "The deed transfer is being processed as we speak. You will have official ownership by Friday." I leaned against the wall, legs suddenly weak. "And the trust provisions?" "That is the beauty of it," Mark said. "The original Millbrook Trust included language mandating the land be used for community recreational purposes. As the new owner, you are bound by that stipulation, but you have complete discretion over how that purpose is fulfilled and who administers it. In other words, I could maintain the field as a soccer facility, but I could also determine who had access and who provided security. Sheriff Sheila's authority over the property had just evaporated. I spent the next 2 days drafting new policies for the field with Mark's guidance. We created clear, fair rules for community use. We established guidelines for behavior that emphasized respect and inclusion rather than punishment. Most importantly, We drafted a formal termination of any implied security arrangement with the sheriff's department. By Friday morning, the paperwork was complete. The field was mine, or rather, it belonged to Wilson Community Recreation Trust, a legal entity I had established to maintain the property in perpetuity. Even if something happened to me, the field would remain available to the community under the guidelines we had created. I sent formal letters to the town council, the school district, the soccer league, and every parent on our team, explaining the change in ownership and the new policies. I emphasized that all children's activities would continue uninterrupted. The only significant change would be in security oversight. Finally, I drafted a letter to Sheriff Sheila Donovan, informing her that her services were no longer required at the property effective immediately. Any law enforcement presence would need to be requested specifically by the new owner, me. As I sealed the envelopes, I felt no triumph, only a calm certainty that I was doing what needed to be done. This was not about revenge. This was about restoring a safe place for children to play without fear, for parents to cheer without reprisal, for a community to gather without intimidation. Sheriff Sheila had taken something precious from us. I was simply taking it back. The papers were signed on a Thursday. Just like that, with a few strokes of a pen, the field that had been the center of our community for generations officially belonged to the Wilson Community Recreation Trust. I kept the name, the layout, the open access, but everything else was about to change. I spent that evening writing up the new field regulations, family-first policies, clear and reasonable rules, community-funded upkeep. No more arbitrary enforcement, no more intimidation, no more fear. Jackson watched me from the doorway of my home office, confusion evident on his face. "Dad, why are you writing all that stuff about the soccer field?" he asked. I motioned him over and pulled him onto my lap, something he usually protested he was too old for, but tonight he came willingly. "Remember how I told you that sometimes we have to stand up when things are not fair?" He nodded solemnly. "Well, I found a way to make things fair again." I explained in simple terms what I had done, watching as understanding slowly dawned in his eyes. "You bought our field?" he asked incredulously. "The whole thing?" "The whole thing," I confirmed. "And now Sheriff Sheila cannot keep me from watching you play." His face lit up for a brief moment before doubt crept back in. "But she has a badge and a gun. She is the sheriff." "On county property, yes, she has authority," I explained carefully. "But this is private property now. She only has authority if the owner asks for her help." "And you are the owner," Jackson said slowly, working it out. "The trust is the owner," I corrected. "I just manage it for the community, for kids like you who deserve to play without adults ruining it." He threw his arms around my neck suddenly, burying his face against my shoulder. "Does this mean you will be at my game on Saturday?" "Front row," I promised, my voice thick with emotion. Nothing could keep me away. The next morning, I called the sheriff's department and asked to speak with the chief deputy. I kept my voice professional as I informed him that the Wilson Community Recreation Trust was terminating the informal security arrangement at the field. "Effective immediately," I added. "Any law enforcement presence on the property must be requested by trust management or in response to an actual emergency call." There was a long pause before the chief deputy responded. "This is unusual, Mr. Wilson. Sheriff Donovan has personally overseen security at community events for years." "The property has changed hands," I replied simply, "and so have the security arrangements. I have sent official notification by certified mail, but I wanted to provide verbal notice as well to avoid any misunderstandings. After hanging up, I posted notices on the community board and the field entrance, explaining the ownership change and new policies. I created an online registration system for field use that was straightforward and fair. By afternoon, word had spread through town. My phone buzzed constantly with messages of disbelief, congratulations, and questions. Many parents were shocked but supportive. Coach Bentley called immediately, his usually gruff voice animated with excitement. "You beautiful, crazy son of a gun," he laughed. "You actually did it. The team parents are throwing together a potluck celebration for Saturday after the game." Not everyone was pleased, of course. Several town council members expressed concern about private interference in public recreation. The mayor left a carefully worded voicemail about exploring the legal implications of the purchase. But these were minor ripples compared to the tsunami I knew was coming. She arrived as I was hanging the new field rules by the entrance. The cruiser pulled into the lot with a spray of gravel, and Sheriff Sheila emerged, slamming the door behind her. She wore her full uniform despite being off-duty, sunglasses firmly in place despite the cloudy day. Everything about her stance conveyed authority threatened. "What do you think you are doing, Wilson?" she demanded, marching toward me. I turned calmly, the laminated rules sheet still in my hand. "Posting the new field regulations, Sheriff Donovan. Can I help you with something?" She snatched the paper from the bulletin board, scanning it with growing incredulity. "This is county property. You cannot simply—" "It is not county property," I interrupted, keeping my voice even. "It never was. The field was held by the Millbrook Trust, which was dissolved due to tax delinquency. The Wilson Community Recreation Trust purchased it legally through proper channels." I held out a folder containing copies of the deed transfer and property records. She ignored it, her face flushing with anger. "This is absurd. You cannot just buy public land." "It was never public land," I repeated. "The county had a management arrangement with the previous trust, but no ownership claim. I have verified this with both the county assessor and the state property office." Her hand moved almost unconsciously to rest on her sidearm, a gesture of intimidation I had seen her use before. "This will not stand, Wilson. The council will overturn this." "They cannot overturn a legal property transfer," I said. "And while we are clarifying things, Sheriff, you should know that your security services are no longer required here. In fact, unless responding to an emergency call, your presence on this property without invitation constitutes trespassing." The irony of using her own tactics against her was not lost on either of us. Her jaw tightened visibly. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more serious," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "You banned me from watching my son play. You humiliated me in front of the community. You abused your authority because I dared to question you. Now the tables have turned and you cannot be here anymore." She stepped closer, voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "This is not over." I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Actually, Sheriff Donovan, this is exactly what over looks like. Please leave the premises immediately, or I will be forced to report a trespassing incident." She stared at me for a long moment, her silence louder than any siren. Then she turned on her heel and stalked back to her cruiser. As she drove away, I noticed Jackson standing by the field, watching everything. He raised his hand in a small wave and I waved back, a promise fulfilled. The tables had turned. The field was ours again, and Saturday's game would be the sweetest one yet. The morning after I confronted Sheila with the deed, my phone would not stop ringing. Word travels fast in small towns, but this news moved like wildfire through dry brush. Some neighbors called to congratulate me. Others demanded explanations. The local Facebook groups exploded with posts and comments. I had become the most controversial figure in Cedar Creek overnight. You cannot just buy public property, Thomas Bentley, the county commissioner, sputtered when he cornered me outside the grocery store. His face had turned crimson, veins bulging at his temples. This is unprecedented and frankly concerning, Mitchell. I stood my ground in the parking lot, shopping bags still in hand. It was never public property, Commissioner. It was privately held and leased to the county. I simply purchased what was legally for sale. The divide in the community grew visible within days. Parents whose children had been affected by Sheila's tyranny brought casseroles to my doorstep and tearfully thanked me. Others, particularly those connected to local government, viewed me with suspicion, as if I had revealed myself as some calculating villain. Sheriff Sheila wasted no time mounting her counterattack. She called an emergency press conference on the steps of the county building. Cameras from the local news station captured her stern expression as she adjusted the microphone. What we have witnessed is nothing short of a power grab by a disgruntled individual, she declared, her voice carrying across the crowded steps. Mr. Mitchell Patterson has used his financial privilege to undermine legitimate authority and bypass proper channels. I watched the broadcast from my living room, my son seated beside me. His eyes were wide with anxiety. "Dad, everyone at school is talking about us," he whispered. "I know, buddy," I said, placing my hand on his shoulder. "But sometimes doing the right thing means standing in the spotlight for a while." That evening, I uploaded the first video to the community forum. It showed Sheila screaming at Mrs. Donovan for clapping too enthusiastically when her daughter scored a goal. The footage was undeniable, Sheila's finger jabbing, her voice ringing with contempt, Mrs. Donovan's shoulders hunched in humiliation. I followed with documents the citations written for excessive cheering, unauthorized refreshments, parents banned for questioning her authority. Each post gathered hundreds of comments. Former victims began sharing their own stories. The dam had broken. Mayor Wilson called me personally after the third video went viral locally. His voice was measured but unmistakably nervous. "Mitchell, I had no idea things had gone this far," he admitted. "Why did no one come forward before?" "Fear," I answered simply. "She had a badge, a gun, and the power to make lives miserable. Who wants to be the first to challenge that?" By week's end, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Sheila's supporters dwindled to a handful of loyalists. When she walked into the diner on Friday morning, conversations fell silent. The community had seen her true face, and they could not unsee it. The following Tuesday, a black sedan with government plates parked outside my office. A thin man in an ill-fitting suit introduced himself as Raymond Porter from the County Zoning Commission. His clipboard trembled slightly in his grip. "We have received multiple complaints about potential code violations at your recently acquired property," he stated, avoiding direct eye contact. "I need to conduct an immediate inspection." I recognized the move for what it was. "May I see the complaints, Mr. Porter?" He shifted uncomfortably. "They were anonymous submissions, sir." "Of course they were," I replied, reaching for my jacket. "Let me grab my keys. You will not mind if I record this inspection." The soccer field failed its inspection on 17 different counts, from insufficient emergency access paths to improper drainage systems. None of these issues had existed the previous month when the county operated the facility. Porter handed me the violation notice with an apologetic shrug. You have 30 days to address these issues, or the property will be deemed unfit for public gathering, he mumbled. The health inspector arrived the next day. The fire marshal followed on Thursday. By Friday, the building inspector had condemned the small equipment shed that had stood safely for 20 years. I documented every visit, every citation, every transparent attempt to shut down the field. My attorney accumulated the paperwork with grim determination. This is coordinated harassment, she told me, but proving it will be difficult unless we can establish a direct connection to Sheila. That connection arrived sooner than expected. On Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. Bolting upright in bed, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 as I rushed down the stairs. The dispatcher promised officers would arrive shortly. The kitchen window had been shattered. Nothing appeared stolen except for one thing, the blue folder labeled Sheila documentation that had been sitting on my counter. The burglar had ignored my wallet, laptop, and other valuables. When the officers arrived, I recognized Deputy Hernandez, who had always seemed uncomfortable enforcing Sheila's park citations. He took detailed notes, his expression grave. "This does not look like a standard break-in," he observed quietly. "No," I agreed. "It looks like someone is afraid of what I know." That afternoon, I drove to the courthouse and filed for a temporary restraining order against Sheriff Sheila Masterson. I also called Evelyn Carter at the Cedar Creek Gazette. "I have a story you might be interested in," I told her. The front page headline on Monday read, "Local Father Seeks Restraining Order Against Sheriff Amid Allegations of Harassment and Intimidation." Beneath it was a photo of my broken kitchen window. Sheila's response was immediate and furious. She issued a formal statement calling the allegations slanderous and threatening legal action against both me and the newspaper. But her voice had lost its authority. Too many people had come forward with their own stories. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house before going to bed. I installed a security system the next day. My son asked if he could sleep in my room. "Dad, are we in danger?" he asked, his voice small in the darkness. I thought carefully before answering. "No, buddy. What we are doing is standing up to someone who has been bullying people for a long time, and bullies do not like that, but I promise you we are safe." I held him until he fell asleep, but remained awake, listening to every creak and whisper of the house. This was no longer about soccer games. This was about abuse of power, and I had challenged someone who was not accustomed to being challenged. The next morning, I received an envelope containing photos of me going about my daily routine, dropping my son at school, buying coffee, entering my office. No note, just the clear message: "I am watching you." Instead of scaring me into submission, it cemented my resolve. I added the photos to my growing file of evidence and called my attorney. "We need to accelerate the timeline," I told her. "She is escalating, and I do not know what she might do next." The county courthouse stood in the center of town, a limestone monument to justice that had witnessed a century of disputes, crimes, and reconciliations. On this crisp autumn morning, it would host another chapter in the town's history. I straightened my tie as I climbed the worn steps, carrying a leather briefcase filled with documentation. My attorney, Catherine Reeves, waited at the entrance. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, her expression composed and determined. "Are you ready for this, Mitchell?" she asked, her voice steady. "Once we file these papers, there is no turning back." I nodded. I have been ready since the day she humiliated my son. Inside, we submitted a comprehensive civil complaint against Sheriff Sheila Masterson, citing abuse of power, harassment, intimidation, and violation of constitutional rights. The clerk's eyes widened as she stamped the documents, her gaze darting nervously toward the sheriff's department across the street. The complaint included 27 signed affidavits from other families who had suffered under Sheila's arbitrary rules, parents who had been ticketed for cheering too loudly, children who had been reduced to tears when their games were interrupted by unnecessary security checks. Even 3 former deputies had come forward, describing how Sheila had instructed them to target specific families who had questioned her authority. By noon, Judge Eleanor Hamilton had reviewed our request for an emergency injunction. Her chambers were wood-paneled and austere, much like the judge herself. "This is highly unusual," she remarked, peering over her reading glasses. "I have known Sheriff Masterson for 15 years. Catherine placed a USB drive on the desk. "Your Honor, please review this footage before making your decision." The video showed Sheila screaming at a mother, whose toddler had wandered onto the field during a water break. Her face contorted with rage as she threatened to arrest the terrified woman for endangering public safety. The toddler wailed in the background. Judge Hamilton's expression remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her pen. When the video ended, she removed her glasses slowly. "The court grants the temporary injunction," she stated. "Sheriff Masterson is hereby prohibited from coming within 500 feet of the soccer field property, Mr. Patterson, or his son, pending full hearing of this matter." The news traveled through Cedar Creek within hours. The courthouse clerk, the bailiff, the paralegal who had made copies, small towns have no secrets. By evening, the Cedar Creek Gazette had published the story online. Judge issues restraining order against sheriff in ongoing dispute. Sheila's response came via the department's official social media page. "This temporary order is based on manipulated evidence and will be vigorously contested." But the carefully constructed facade of authority had cracked visibly. The hearing date was set for 2 weeks later. During that time, the town seemed to hold its collective breath. People spoke in hushed tones when they saw me at the grocery store or post office. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others offered quiet words of support. My daughter cried herself to sleep after Sheila banned her grandmother from games for bringing homemade cookies, Mrs. Templeton whispered to me outside the pharmacy. "Thank you for doing what the rest of us were too afraid to do." Meanwhile, my son's soccer team continued to play on their field, their real field, without the looming presence of mirrored sunglasses and a badge. The children played with abandon. The parents cheered without restraint. It was how Saturday mornings were meant to be. The night before the hearing, I sat on my son's bed as he finished his math homework. "Dad," he said suddenly, looking up from his textbook, "Tommy said his mom thinks you are going to lose tomorrow. That Sheriff Sheila always wins." I considered my words carefully. The thing about bullies, buddy, is that they usually win because people are scared. But when someone finally stands up and others see it as possible, the bully's power starts to disappear. Tomorrow is not about winning or losing. It is about showing the truth. He nodded solemnly, then asked the question that had been weighing on him. "Will I have to talk in court?" I shook my head firmly. "No, you never have to face her again, I promise you that." That night, I reviewed our evidence one final time, mentally preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most significant confrontation of my life. Not just for me or my son, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of corrupted authority. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Every wooden bench was filled with spectators, parents, teachers, local business owners, even teenagers who should have been in school. They whispered among themselves as Catherine and I took our seats at the plaintiff's table. The energy in the room was palpable, a mixture of anticipation and lingering fear. When Sheriff Sheila entered through the side door, the whispers ceased abruptly. She wore civilian clothes, a charcoal pantsuit that seemed to diminish her somehow. Without her uniform, badge, and utility belt, she appeared smaller, almost ordinary. Her attorney, James Whitfield, was a tall man with a reputation for aggressive tactics in the courtroom. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Hamilton entered. The proceedings began with opening statements. Whitfield portrayed Sheila as a dedicated public servant who had maintained order and safety in challenging circumstances. He characterized me as a wealthy, vindictive individual who had purchased property solely to pursue a personal vendetta. "My client was simply doing her job," he concluded. "Mr. Patterson's actions represent a dangerous precedent where the wealthy can overrule lawful authority when it inconveniences them." Catherine rose calmly. Her opening was measured and devastating in its simplicity. "This case is not about a soccer field," she began. "It is about power, and what happens when power operates without accountability or compassion. Over the next few hours, Your Honor will hear from ordinary citizens who experienced extraordinary harassment. You will see evidence of targeted intimidation. Most importantly, you will understand why my client felt compelled to take such unusual measures to protect his child and his community." The testimony began with Marcus Jennings, a former deputy who had served under Sheila for 3 years. "Sheriff Masterson explicitly instructed us to focus enforcement efforts on parents who had disagreed with her in public forums," he stated, his voice steady despite Sheila's glare from across the room. She kept a list of names in her desk drawer, people she called problem parents. We were expected to monitor them closely and find reasons to issue citations. When asked why he had not reported this behavior, his answer was simple. She made it clear that anyone who questioned her methods would find themselves without a job and without references. Sarah Alvarez testified next, describing how Sheila had banned her from games for bringing unauthorized refreshments, homemade empanadas for the team. "She said I was violating health codes," Sarah recounted, her voice breaking. "Then she threw the food in the trash while the children watched. My daughter was so embarrassed she quit the team." As the morning progressed, the pattern became undeniable. Person after person described arbitrary rules, selective enforcement, and deliberate humiliation. Catherine methodically connected each incident to documented evidence, reports, citations, witness statements. After lunch recess, she introduced the video evidence. The courtroom screen displayed footage captured by parents and security cameras. Sheila screaming at volunteers. Sheila interrupting games for security sweeps that targeted specific families. Sheila standing over a crying child whose water bottle had spilled on her boots. During one particularly damning clip, I glanced at Sheila. Her composure had slipped, revealing something I had never seen before: fear. She whispered frantically to her attorney, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable. When it was Sheila's turn to testify, her previous confidence had evaporated. Under Catherine's precise questioning, her answers became contradictory, defensive. "So you maintain that banning Mr. Patterson was necessary for public safety?" Catherine asked. "Absolutely," Sheila insisted. "He was disruptive and challenging to authority." "Can you point to any specific incident where Mr. Patterson threatened anyone or created an unsafe condition?" Sheila hesitated. "He undermined my authority. That creates an unsafe environment." "Your authority," Catherine repeated. "Not public safety, but your authority. Thank you for that clarification." By mid-afternoon, Judge Hamilton had seen enough. Her judgment was unequivocal. This court finds overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse of power and retaliatory conduct, she declared. Sheriff Masterson's actions represent a profound betrayal of public trust. The judge ordered Sheila to pay substantial damages, permanently barred her from the soccer field property, and most significantly, recommended a full investigation into her conduct by the State Law Enforcement Oversight Committee. A badge is not a shield against accountability, Judge Hamilton concluded. It is a symbol of the public's trust, and that trust has been violated repeatedly and egregiously. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in muted cheers and tears. Parents embraced each other. Former deputies nodded in grim satisfaction. I sat perfectly still, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Sheila did not look at anyone as she was escorted out. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes fixed on the floor. The power that had seemed so absolute, so untouchable, had dissolved under judicial scrutiny. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with cameras and microphones. I declined extensive comment, offering only a brief statement. This was never about one person. It was about ensuring that our community remains a place where power serves people, not the other way around. 3 weeks after the court ruling, Sheriff Sheila Masterson submitted her resignation. There was no press conference, no public statement. The letter, according to sources in the department, was brief and unapologetic. She left town shortly afterward, reportedly taking a security position in a different state. The transformation that followed was remarkable in its swiftness. Deputy Rodriguez was appointed interim sheriff and immediately implemented new community-oriented policies. Citations at public events dropped to near zero. Officers began attending games as participants rather than enforcers, cheering from the sidelines, occasionally joining scrimmages during breaks. The first Saturday without Sheila's shadow hanging over the field felt almost surreal. Parents spread blankets and unfolded chairs without measuring invisible boundaries. Coolers filled with homemade snacks appeared without fear of inspection. The children played with abandon, their shouts and laughter carrying across the grass without hesitation. I stood at the edge of the field, watching my son chase the ball with pure joy on his face. For the first time in months, his eyes did not dart nervously toward the parking lot. He was simply a boy playing soccer on a Saturday morning, exactly as it should have been all along. "Quite a difference," remarked Eleanor Fisher, standing beside me with her ever-present thermos of coffee. She had been one of the first parents to sign an affidavit for our case. "Almost hard to believe," I agreed. "Remember when she issued you a citation for excessive vocal support?" Eleanor laughed. $200 for cheering when my daughter blocked a goal. Ridiculous. After the game, we held an impromptu community celebration. The parents had organized it secretly. Tables laden with food appeared as if by magic. Someone brought a portable speaker system. Children raced across the field while adults mingled and shared stories, many speaking openly for the first time about their experiences under Sheila's reign. Mayor Wilson approached me as I was refilling my lemonade. His handshake was firm, his expression genuine. "I owe you an apology, Mitchell," he said quietly. "I should have seen what was happening, should have done something before it reached this point." I nodded, accepting his words. We all let it happen gradually. That is how these things work step by step, until suddenly you are living in a reality you never would have accepted if it had arrived all at once. That evening, as the celebration wound down, several parents approached me with a proposal. They wanted to form a community advocacy group, a watchdog organization to ensure that no future authority figure could accumulate unchecked power over public spaces. "We are calling it sideline rights," explained Thomas Morgan, a normally reserved accountant who had found his voice during the lawsuit. "We would be honored if you would serve as our first chairperson." I agreed without hesitation. The following week, 23 people attended our first meeting, held in the community center. We drafted guidelines for park usage, established channels for grievance resolution, and created a system of rotating volunteer supervisors for youth events. The county commissioners, eager to rebuild public trust, ratified our proposals unanimously. One evening, as my son and I walked home from practice, he asked the question that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "Dad, did you really buy the field just because she banned you?" I considered how to answer honestly, without burdening him with adult complexities. "Not exactly," I replied carefully. "I bought it because sometimes systems fail to protect the people they are meant to serve. When that happens, those who can take action have a responsibility to do so." He kicked a stone thoughtfully. "Tommy's dad says you are a hero." "I am not a hero," I said firmly. "I am just someone who had the means to fix something broken. The real heroes were the people who stood up and told their stories even though they were afraid." We walked in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I want to be like that when I grow up, someone who fixes broken things." I draped my arm across his shoulders, overwhelmed by pride and hope. "You already are, buddy." The soccer field remains the heart of our community. I still own it legally, but in every meaningful way, it belongs to the children who play there and the families who gather on Saturday mornings. The deed rests in a trust that will eventually transfer ownership to the community itself. I never intended to become anything more than a father cheering from the sidelines. Life had other plans, but each time I take my place on those familiar bleachers, watching my son run across the grass with unfettered joy, I am reminded of an essential truth. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in the smallest places. Sometimes standing your ground on a patch of grass in a forgotten corner of a small town sends ripples that change lives forever. And sometimes, when someone misuses their power to take something precious from you, the answer is simple. You buy the field, you change the rules, you restore what was lost, and you ensure that no one can ever take it away again.